Hi, so this video is about ways to avoid following precedent. So we have set out all the rules of stare decisis, about the Supreme Court, how they bind everybody below and they have to follow their own decisions, but you've got practice directions that state they don't always have to. We've talked about the Court of Appeal and the Young exception, so when the Court of Appeal doesn't have to follow its own decisions. Now, this next bit is about how any court can avoid following precedent, and there are three parts to it. We're going to look at overruling, reversing, and distinguishing. So first of all, overruling. Well, what does this mean? This means that judges decide an earlier case is wrong and should no longer be law. So they get rid of it, they overrule it, they say this is no longer good law, we don't want this case ever followed again. So the Supreme Court can overrule the Court of Appeal. Other cases can overrule a previous case. So if you remember with attempted crimes, the case of Shivpuri, that overrules the case of Anderton. So Anderton had said you are not guilty if you attempt an impossible crime. Shivpuri, a year later, was like, no, that's wrong. That is bad law. That was made in error. So now Shivpuri overruled Anderton. The precedent of Anderton no longer stands. The law is, as it is in Shivpuri, that you can be guilty if you attempt an impossible crime. So you can use Shivpuri and Anderton. Another case example, G and R, where two boys set fire to a wheelie bin and they were talking about recklessness. Caldwell recklessness was the precedent. So you had to, if you were taking a risk, it was from a reasonable person's point of view. Would a reasonable person foresee a risk of damage? If so, then the defendant was guilty. GNR in 2003 said, no, we don't like this decision. We are going to overrule it and subjective recklessness must be used. So did the defendant, not a reasonable person, did the defendant foresee a risk and go ahead and take the risk? So overruling, you are basically kind of wiping out a previous case. The next issue is reversing. Now, this deals just with one case where judges reverse your decision. So Anderton and Shivpuri is not reversing because they're two separate cases, whereas here you reverse a decision. So the case is appealed and judges reverse the decision in that case. So for example, the Court of Appeal might have decided something and the Supreme Court, it then gets appealed up from the Court of Appeal, remember, to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is like, we don't like that decision the Court of Appeal made, we are going to reverse it, i.e. we are going to change it. They could quash the conviction. So in other words, the person was found guilty, the Supreme Court said, the Court of Appeal said you're still guilty. Supreme Court turns around and says, no, we don't think you are guilty, so we are going to reverse that decision. It can work the other way. So in a case called K, where the boy, he's messing around with chemistry, like chemicals, and he goes into the toilet, has a test tube and here's someone coming, turns the hand dryer like upside down, pours the chemicals in there, person comes in, goes to the loo, washes their hands, washes their face, and then you know what happens, puts on the hand dryer and the acid flies into this person's face. Now the magistrates said he was not guilty of ABH. But what happened was that was then appealed by the prosecution to the High Court, Queen's Bench Division, and the Queen's Bench Division reversed that decision and convicted him. So magistrates, not guilty. Same case, High Court, Queen's Bench Division, and they reversed the decision. So K was guilty. Now, the final one, distinguishing, this is quite important. So what happens here is you can avoid precedent by finding factual differences in the case so that you don't have to follow precedent. So really good example of this, let's go back to Brown. So if you remember in Brown, it was the group of guys filming themselves performing in harmful sexual activity. And in Brown, you know, they were using things like fish hooks, stinging nettles, nails, very memorable case. What then happened was, a few years later, you had the case of Wilson. Now, Mr. Wilson branded his initials on his wife's buttocks, and she actually needed medical treatment. And he was convicted of, I think it was ABH in the end, and on appeal, he said, my case is not like Brown, because they'd followed the precedent in Brown. Brown was House of Lords at the time, so now Supreme Court, House of Lords, and Wilson's in the Court of Appeal. We know the Court of Appeal is below the House of Lords, so they should have followed the House of Lords. But in Wilson, they distinguished. They said, no, our case is factually different to Brown. In Brown, it was a group of guys, and in Wilson, it's a husband and wife in private. And what he did, he branded her. Branding is like a tattoo. And you actually said in Brown that that is a recognised exception. Tattooing is fine. It's not ABH. You can consent to tattooing. And that was allowed. The Court of Appeal said, yep, okay, we accept your case is factually different. The material facts of the case are different. You are right. Branding is not sadomasochism. Branding is like a tattoo. So Mr. Wilson was found not guilty by the Court of Appeal. Okay, so those are 3 ways to avoid following precedent. So no overruling, explanation, case, reversing, explanation, case, and distinguishing explanation and a case.